This is Third Paradigm, and I'm Teresa Coraggio. Today I'm talking about good old boys, Hatfill and Malone. And this episode was prompted because on Monday I'm going to be interviewed by Mark Kulak at Housatonics, thanks to the logistics being figured out by Vilma, who does Elgata Politica. And I also thought I should do some research on that. So I started looking at some of his saved archive on Malone Talks, and one of them was on Hatfill and Malone being interviewed on Tommy's podcast, and this was very recent. This was June 8th, 2023. So this was the mysterious Hatfill that Malone quoted in my last episode, where he says, "We should give it to really sick kids because they're going to die anyhow." So that was the one exception that he made for giving the vaccine to kids. And at the time, I didn't even know how to spell that name because it was unfamiliar to me, and here he is. So I then sent a message to JJ Cooey, who I will also be doing a future interview with, again thanks to Vilma setting that up, and I said, I'd love to do a study hall on this talk because it is really, I think, a juicy one and one in which Malone abandons the mask. And JJ sent back and said, well, as a matter of fact, I'm doing a study hall on that tonight. So I will be in that chat, but I wanted to also put some thoughts out here because I do think there are a lot of clues in this. As always, I like to start with why this is important. I think we're going through what I call the 4D reset. The first is depopulation, and there are a lot of good people who are paying attention to that aspect, including the Bragans. The second is dispossession, and that's something I don't think we're paying enough attention to, and that's really my forte, looking at the economics in my book, How to Dismantle an Empire, and in a recent episode called Inflation Colonization, I look at how our houses in particular are being taken away from us, along with our savings. And the third is destruction. So all the episodes I've done on geoengineering and its relationship to fires, to floods, to the decrease in our food sources and the attacks on our food supplies. But then the fourth is deception. And every episode that I'm doing on Malone is about deception. In the early days, I did a lot on propaganda and censorship, but at this point, that part of the psyops is already done for the people who I'm talking to. And so for these people, I think we need to be figuring out the next layer of deception and how that's being pulled on us. Who is Stephen Hatfill? Malone tells us this in his introduction, where he says, I have the pleasure of talking to the esteemed Dr. Hatfill, who I will not be confronting about his connections in the intelligence community. So this becomes an inside joke with them. Hatfill worked in Fort Detrick in Frederick, Maryland, near my hometown, during the anthrax attacks in 2001. He became a person of interest, in part because he had ordered a prescription for Cipro, which is the antidote to anthrax, 2 days before the attack. When his home was searched in 2002, there was another prescription that was found made out to his girlfriend, which was buried in a mason jar full of coffee beans. Hatfill is also the author of a book called 3 Seconds to Midnight, and I want you to remember that when Malone calls others of us black-pilled. Hatfill starts out talking about hydroxychloroquine tests that showed that it improved outcomes 50 to 60% if given at the beginning of a time someone was admitted to the hospital. And then he says that this vaccine has ruined the trust in all vaccines. And now the tragedy is that there are stockpiled all of the vaccines for every person in the U.S. for the bird flu, but they'll probably never be used because the trust is gone. Then they talk about the Ebola outbreak in Kenya, where Hatfill was involved, and Malone says he was practically parachuted into Ames, Iowa, to work with a company called New Link Genetics, which had an Ebola vaccine that they were trying to work on. And he says this was with the active participation, wink, wink, nod, nod, he says, of DITRA. Hatfill says that the problem is that the CDC doesn't want to do anything until the WHO does, and the WHO doesn't do anything until the CDC does. And that's why they didn't want to call the H1N1 a pandemic of concern. And they sat on the Ebola vaccine. They gave it, Malone says, to the lowly, measly DOD. And they had already screwed the pooch, as he says, by having used vaccination as a way to get genetic information on bin Laden. What I've noticed is that Malone's language really changes when he's there talking with the good old boys. On the way to Ames, Malone is told that it's a respiratory Ebola. And so he says that had it been actually a respiratory Ebola, people would have lined up around the block to take the nastiest vaccine. But in fact, it was little more than a flu. And Hatfill mentions that the few children who died, they had terrible things wrong with them anyhow. So Malone ends up giving New Line Genetics 3 choices where they can either try to go through BARDA and get their own vaccine approved, or they can hand it over to the WHO, or they can sell it to Merck. And in the end, that's the deal that he facilitates. He also mentions that the DoD develops the VSV Ebola vaccine. And Hatfill mentions, yeah, I think that was right after I left Diedrich, and there were some good people involved in that. And they talk about how the DoD ended up not getting credit for that it was all given to HHS and BARDA. This interview is called Pandemic Preparedness, and I assume that's also the topic of Hatfill's book on 3 Seconds to Midnight. So Malone says, so where do we go now? What happens? And Hatfill says, well, it depends on who's in office. Deborah Birx, she's nuts. She's lost her mind. I'm sure that doesn't count as defamation. And then Malone says, well, should we shut it down and give it to Emory? And Hatfill says, you need to fire 6 levels down at the CDC. That's my 6-level solution. In an episode I called The Road to Heaven is Paved with Good Intentions, I recount a comment debate that I had with a Midwestern doctor where he or she was talking about Malone's reform of the HHS. And I had read that article at the time, so I went back to it, and what it talked about was changing the rules, changing the laws so that anyone can be fired at will. And so that seems to be his reform, is to essentially clean house. Malone asks, so what if the shit hits the fan tomorrow? And Hatfill says, I've got some plans. He talks about 20,000 different pharmaceutical products that they have and how they should be tested against the 26 strains of different viruses. And that this is a big job, but that's something that they just need to do. Malone then talks about how in January of 2020, when he was working with Sina Bavari, that he was vetted to be chief scientist for DITRA, he says first, and then corrects himself to what I think is RITA, R-I-T-A, and I don't know what that is. He says that was around the time of the anthrax investigations, and that just gutted morale. He also mentions in January 2020 was when Michael Callahan said that we, meaning the CIA, can't compete with Big Pharma. But within a month and a half, I had found famotidine, so that proved that wasn't true. Hatfill says, we're not trying to rule out the pharmaceutical companies. And Malone says, well, they're not the innovators. Look at Emory Institute and how they sold something and then it sold again, and now we have the new miracle drug for coronavirus. What's he talking about there? Then Malone is talking about, it sounds like privatizing government agencies like maybe the CDC, and he says, so, would you give it to Lawrence Livermore? Then he segues to talking about giving a talk in Florida with John Luttel, I think the name is, and he is talking about how it would be really useful if they had rapid response genomes so that they could make those vaccines within 2 weeks once they knew that there was a new virus, and that this was especially good for responding to ethnically targeted viruses, and that is something that can be engineered. And apparently John Luttel got some heat for that, like a recent presidential candidate has. And so what John responded was, hey, can you give me some sources for that? And Malone said, John, I am a little offended. I am the goddamn expert, but yes, here's this and this and this and this. So maybe he might want to give those to Kennedy too. Hatfill says, poor John, he got into trouble over telling them you killed millions by not authorizing ivermectin. He ended up having to go for mental health checkups. And Malone says, same strategy they used for Meryl Nass. And Hatfill says, oh, I don't like her. We're not going to talk about her. And then he laughs. And then Malone says, I just had a drop and it glitches. Very conveniently. And Hatfill says, let's start from scratch. And then these 3 seconds to oblivion guys say, from Malone, basically we have to burn down the house and rebuild it. Plays right into the hands of our enemies. Hatfill says, I'm past worried. I'm scared. Malone says, yeah, things are so poo-barred, I despair. It's bunker time. What would it look like if he was black-pilled? This is the highest calling, God's work for the American people in a selfless environment in which we were paid a fraction of what we would have made in big pharma. And we get no end of grief. You're controlled opposition because you worked for the government. Then Hatfill says, Robert, here's what we need. An infectious disease. I'm looking at you. Your eyes are in the front of your head. My eyes are in the front of my head. Carnivores have their eyes in the front of their head. Leaf eaters have their eyes on the side. We've got too many damn leaf eaters in charge. We need action people. Malone says, but who's Patton? Rick Bright? They both laugh. Our leadership are sycophants. And that Peter Marks, he'll say and do anything. Hatfill says, fire half the FDA. Fire half the NIH. Malone then talks about how the Vaccine Research Center had an unlimited budget to develop an AIDS vaccine. They didn't seem to have done the research on Peter Duesberg or on Robert Kennedy's book or maybe on Celia Farber's new one. But he says, well, I'm the lieutenant and you're the colonel, so what do we do now, Colonel? And the Colonel Hatfill says, you should have these tools. We should have these tools developed where a spectrometer that is small enough to fit on your keychain is something you just blow into, and it tells you whether you have a viral infection. And then you have 2 or 3 different drugs that you just pop for whatever viral infection it is. Malone says, so your solution is clean house and new tech and mini patents. And Hatfill says, and local authorities. No one is going to the community level. He says, so you need to ask them, how many dead bodies can you handle? if there's 40% mortality, you're stacking bodies. And Malone laughs and says, now it's time to get out the big excavator. So Hatfill says you need to train the local authorities and have civil defense training. If they can handle the local medical and all the local deaths, then you can move from the cities to the counties, from the counties to the states, and from the state to the federal. So this is interesting because when Malone subscribed to my Substack, it was because I talked about decentralization. And Malone here is calling decentralized capabilities having the local answer to the Central Intelligence Agency. So you skip over all of those levels in between and just force everyone at the local level to be answering to one central authority. That's what he means by decentralized. Malone ends by asking, so who's calling you? Bobby Kennedy or Trump or DeSantis? And Hatfill makes a joke, probably the IRS. Then Malone talks about how Peter Navarro wants him to move to Palm Beach, but he can't find land enough to be able to store his horses there. And Hatfill says, get your ass associated with Navarro. I worship the guy. He gets things done. Navarro, of course, is a Trump appointee, so I think that answers the question, along with this new move with Paul Alexander to put everyone under the Trump umbrella with Malone. And also makes it where Kennedy saying that Malone has given up his career in order to say the things he did is absolutely not true. Navarro is still asking him to move to Palm Beach. So it's more that Malone, after he has smeared Kennedy's reputation by association with him, is now throwing Kennedy under the bus. I'm looking forward to what the insightful JJ Couey is going to say about this video and his wonderful crew. And I will post a link to that on the Substack, and also looking forward to Monday with Mark at Housatonic, and I will post a link to that also. For more on this, here's The Road to Heaven is Paved with Good Intentions, and this is the whole Malone playlist. Thank you for watching.